Snow fell thick that night, silent and endless, turning the mountains into white ghosts. The world seemed to hush itself as the wagon creaked up the rocky trail, carrying a girl too small for the bundle of fate tied to her name. Clara had never seen the mountains before. She had never even seen a man like him. But her uncle said there was no choice, she was to be sent to the mountain man. To live with him, to be his. At 19, she was still as untouched as the first snow that covered the pines. Her hands were soft, her voice quiet, and her heart trembling beneath layers of wool. The stories about him had spread through the valley, of a man too large for doors, too silent for company, who wrestled bears and split trees with his bare hands. Some said he had no heart. Some said he'd lost it long ago. When they reached the cabin, her uncle didn't even knock. He shouted his name once, and from the darkness, a shape emerged, tall as the doorframe, broad as the timber it was made from. His beard was thick, his eyes cold, but not cruel. He looked like a storm that had learned to walk. "This is the girl," her uncle said, pushing her forward. "You agreed." The man's gaze dropped to her, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Clara wanted to shrink, to vanish into the snow. But he only nodded once, then turned his back and walked into the cabin. "Go on, girl," her uncle hissed. "He'll take care of you." Then he left. The door shut behind her with a heavy thud. Inside, the air was thick with pine smoke and the smell of leather. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls. The man said nothing as he took her cloak and hung it by the door. He didn't touch her again. Didn't even look at her. "Your room's upstairs," he said, voice deep and steady. "Food's on the table." That was it. For days, he barely spoke. He worked outside from dawn till dusk, chopping wood, fixing fences, tending to animals that were more obedient than men. She cooked, cleaned, and tried to stay out of his way. Yet, every time he came inside, his boots heavy, his hair wet with snow, she felt the cabin grow smaller. Not with fear, but with something she didn't understand. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind either. He was simply there. A presence that filled the silence. On the 7th night, a blizzard came. It howled through the pines like a wild animal. The wind broke shutters and forced smoke down the chimney. When the door cracked open, Clara ran to brace it, but the gust threw her backward. Then he was there, blocking the storm, his strength swallowing the chaos. He slammed it shut and turned to her. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks pale, and her hands shook. "You'll freeze if you stand there," he said quietly. "Come closer to the fire." She hesitated, then obeyed. He brought out blankets, wrapped one around her shoulders, and crouched beside the fire to dry her hair. His fingers brushed against her neck, rough, calloused, yet gentle as he worked. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said finally. "You didn't," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her. He glanced at her then, really looked, and something in his expression softened. "You shouldn't have been sent here," he murmured. She looked up, startled. "Why?" "Because I'm not what you need." His words hung heavy, like the snow outside. But she didn't believe them. In that moment, she saw something behind the giant's stillness, a loneliness older than the mountains themselves. The days that followed changed her. He taught her how to build a fire with wet wood, how to track a deer through snow, how to listen to the forest's breath. She learned to read his silence, the way his shoulders eased when she laughed softly, the way he left food by her door when she forgot to eat. One morning, she woke to find him gone. She stepped outside, the cold biting her lips, and followed his trail until she reached a clearing. He stood there, shirtless in the snow, chopping wood. Each strike was a thunderclap. His muscles moved like the earth itself shifting. "You'll catch your death," she called, voice trembling. He stopped mid-swing and looked at her. "You shouldn't be out here." "Then neither should you." For the first time, he smiled, a slow, broken thing. "Fair enough." From that day, she stopped being afraid. She began helping him with the work, laughing when she slipped on ice, and he'd catch her before she fell. Sometimes, at night, they sat by the fire, and he'd tell her stories, not of monsters or men, but of the stars, of the trees that outlived empires. One night, as the fire dimmed, she asked, "Why did you live alone here?" He stared into the flames for a long time. "Because I lost everything worth keeping." "What happened?" "My wife. My child. Fever took them. Long ago." His voice cracked like wood under pressure. "After that, the mountains were the only place quiet enough to live with the ghosts." She didn't speak. She only reached out and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. From then, something unseen grew between them, not desire at first, but understanding. A quiet companionship that neither dared to name. He began to wait for her laughter. She began to listen for his boots outside. When spring came, the valley folk rode up. They had heard rumors that the giant had taken the girl, that she was kept against her will. They came to bring her back. They found her tending a small garden by the cabin, sunlight in her hair. "Clara," one of the men called. "We're taking you home." She turned, calm and steady. "I am home." The man's jaw dropped. "He's twice your age. He's the only man who's never raised his voice to me. The only man who looked at me and saw more than a burden." The door opened then, and the mountain man stepped out. The crowd froze. His size was enough to silence them, but it was the look in his eyes that made them lower their weapons. "She stays because she wants to," he said simply. The men glanced between them, uncertain. And then they left, one by one, until only the snow and the wind remained. That night, she sat by the fire again, but this time, he sat beside her. No words passed between them. Only the soft sound of breath and flame. He reached out slowly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. She looked up at him, her heart steady. "You don't have to stay here forever," he said. "I know. Then why do you?" She smiled faintly. "Because for the first time in my life, I feel safe. Because the world down there only saw a girl to give away. You saw someone worth keeping." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a kind of peace that hadn't lived there for years. Outside, the snow melted. Inside, something far deeper began to bloom, quietly, fiercely, like a flower that dared to grow in the shadow of mountains. No one ever called her the scent girl again. To the valley below, they became a myth, of the giant who found his heart again, and the girl who wasn't afraid to love him back. And high in that cabin, where the smoke curled into the dawn, two souls sat side by side, no longer broken, no longer alone. The mornings came softer after the thaw. Snow still clung to the high ridges, but the valley below shimmered with meltwater and wildflowers. Clara woke each day to the sound of Luke splitting wood or the rhythmic scrape of his axe against bark. Sometimes, when she lingered half awake, she'd hear him humming, low, rough notes that broke the silence like sunlight through mist. He never knew she listened. She never told him she did. Their life had fallen into a rhythm, quiet, unspoken, yet filled with small, steady moments that stitched them together. She cooked while he worked, he fixed what broke without being asked. When storms came, they read by the fire, Luke's voice slow, careful, as if every word were a fragile thing he didn't want to drop. Clara began keeping a journal. She wrote about the way his hands dwarfed every tool, the way his shadow stretched across the cabin wall, and how the nights didn't feel lonely anymore. One evening, she found him sitting on the porch, carving something from a piece of pine. The sun had dipped low, painting his hair gold. "What are you making?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Not sure yet. Guess I'll know when it's done." She smiled. "That's how I feel about my life here." That made him glance up, eyes gentle beneath his brow. "And are you content with how it's shaping?" "Yes," she said, meaning it more than he could know. He nodded and went back to carving, but his mouth curved slightly, the kind of half-smile that stays long after it's gone. Weeks turned into months. The forest changed its skin, the streams ran clear, and deer began to wander near the clearing again. Luke taught her how to fish, how to read the direction of wind, how to tell from the trees when rain was coming. He was patient with her, but never condescending. When she failed, he only chuckled, the deep sound of it filling the air. Once, when she dropped a trout back into the water by accident, she gasped in frustration. Luke laughed so hard he nearly lost his footing. "Guess that one wasn't meant for dinner," he said. "Then you cook next time," she teased. He grinned, "A real one this time," and nodded. "Deal." That night, they burned the fish he caught. Both of them ended up eating bread and laughing like children. After that, laughter became part of the cabin, a quiet kind, soft but alive. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not in the way men from the valley once had, but like a man who couldn't believe the world still had warmth left for him. And sometimes she found herself watching him, wondering how someone so large, so silent, could carry such gentleness in his hands. One evening, thunder rolled in from the peaks. The air turned heavy, blue with lightning. She ran outside to pull the laundry in just as the rain began. Luke appeared from the shed, took the basket from her arms, and together they rushed inside, dripping and breathless. They stood in the doorway laughing, water on their faces, the storm raging around them. "Always chasing weather," he said, shaking his head. "I don't mind the rain," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "No, I suppose you wouldn't." The way he said it made her heart tighten, as though he saw right through her, saw the girl who had been sent away, and the woman she was slowly becoming. That night, the thunder didn't let up. The cabin shook with it. She couldn't sleep. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and found him awake by the dying fire. "You should rest," she whispered. "I don't sleep much when it storms," he said. She sat across from him. For a while, neither spoke. The firelight painted his face in golden shadow, softening the harsh lines the world had carved into him. "Do you miss them?" she asked carefully. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Every day. I'm sorry." He nodded once. "You remind me of her sometimes." Clara looked up. "Your wife?" "No, my daughter." His voice cracked on the last word. "She had your quiet way. Always listening before speaking." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "What was her name?" "Lily." She whispered it, as though saying it might keep the name alive. "Lily." The fire popped between them. Then, gently, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers twitched, as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without purpose. They sat that way for a long time. When she finally stood, she leaned down and pressed a small, trembling kiss to the back of his hand. He didn't move, didn't speak, only closed his eyes. After that night, something changed. They didn't talk about it, but the air between them softened. He began leaving little things by her door, wildflowers, carved trinkets, once even a small wooden bird. She started humming while she worked, melodies that reminded her of the low songs he used to hum in the mornings. They never spoke of love, yet it lived there, in the spaces between chores, in the quiet glances over the dinner table, in the way she'd fix his coat when it tore or the way he'd make sure her boots were warm by the fire. By autumn, the world around them had turned gold. They harvested what little the soil had given them, dried fruit for winter, stacked wood in neat, high piles. Clara's hair had grown longer, Luke had begun to trim his beard. One day, as she was sweeping, she found a small box on the table. Inside was the carving he'd been working on that first spring, a delicate wooden pendant shaped like a mountain flower. She turned it over and saw her name etched on the back, each letter careful and deep. When he came in from outside, she held it out. "Luke, this is beautiful." He shrugged, embarrassed. "Didn't mean for you to find it yet." "Why?" "Wasn't sure if you'd want it." She stepped closer, holding it against her chest. "It's the kindest thing anyone's ever given me." He looked down at her then, and for a moment, she thought he might speak, might finally say the words that had lived between them for months. But he didn't. He just reached out, tied the string gently around her neck, and let his hand linger there, against her collarbone. Her heart beat so hard she thought he must feel it. From that day, she wore it always. Winter came again, fierce and early. The storms were heavier this time, trapping them for days. Luke grew quieter, more watchful. He worried about the roof, the food, her warmth. But she only smiled when he fussed, telling him she'd grown used to the mountain's moods. One night, when the cold was so sharp it seemed to bite the glass, she found him outside, standing under the stars. Snow dusted his hair and shoulders. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, wrapping her shawl tighter. He turned, eyes catching the moonlight. "Listening." "To what?" "The mountain," he said. "It talks, if you're still enough." She stepped beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his arm through his coat. "What's it saying tonight?" He smiled faintly. "That I ain't alone anymore." She looked up at him, this man who once seemed carved from stone, and saw the softness that had been buried beneath years of silence. Without thinking, she slipped her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers. No words were needed. After that night, they were never far from each other. They shared everything, the work, the fire, the quiet hours before dawn. Sometimes she'd fall asleep in the chair by the hearth, and he'd lift her, careful as though she were made of glass, laying her in her bed. Other times, she'd wake to find him watching the sunrise, and she'd sit beside him, leaning against his shoulder in the half-light. Once, she asked, "Do you ever think you could leave this place?" He shook his head. The world down there forgot how to be simple. Up here, it's just us. The way life was meant to be. She smiled. Then I suppose I was meant for it too. You were meant for more than this mountain, Clara. Maybe, she said softly. But this mountain gave me you. The years passed quietly, each one layering over the last like the rings inside a tree. Their hair turned a little grayer, their steps a little slower, but their hearts stayed steady. One spring, Clara fell ill. Just a fever, nothing more, but to Luke, it was as if the world had stopped. He sat by her bed, changing cloths, whispering her name. When she finally woke, weak but smiling, he let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. Thought I'd lost you, he said hoarsely. You'd never lose me, she whispered back. Not after everything you gave me. He brushed the hair from her forehead and pressed his lips there, a silent vow of love that didn't need words. When she was strong again, they took a walk to the ridge above the cabin. From there, the world spread wide, rivers shining, pines whispering below. Do you ever miss the valley? He asked. She shook her head. No. Down there, I was sent. Up here, I chose. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded. I reckon I needed you to remind me life still has beginnings. And I needed you to show me it could be gentle. They stood there, hands entwined, watching the wind carry clouds across the sky. The mountains around them were vast and endless, but they felt small only in the best way, as though they finally belonged somewhere greater than themselves. When they walked back, she paused at the doorway and looked up at the cabin, their home, built from grief and healed by love. Smoke curled from the chimney, the smell of pine filled the air, and the sound of his boots followed her inside. That night, she lit the fire, and he sat beside her. Neither spoke for a long while. Then he took her hand, turned it palm up, and traced the lines there with his thumb. Strange, he murmured. I spent half my life trying not to feel, and now I can't imagine a day without it. She smiled. Then don't. We've got all the days we need. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Inside, two hearts, once broken by the world, rested at peace, not because they had found perfection, but because they had found each other. And the mountain, eternal and unmoving, stood witness, holding their love the way it held its snow, quietly, endlessly, without needing to be seen.